Welcome, everybody. My name is David Kramer. I am the director of the library here at the Jewish Theological Seminary, where we do many wonderful things, and one of my greatest privileges is to be involved and enjoy the fruits, the true joy that comes from the very, very hard work of producing the exceptional exhibits that we've been able to mount in the Dorothy T. Goldman Exhibition Gallery since we have reopened as the new library here at JTS. And those of you who were able to go inside and to see, even in a preliminary way, the exhibit already, I hope you appreciate what that modest but very, very beautiful space makes possible, because we have been able, and we intend to keep on, doing exhibits that are very deep and rich and help to educate us in a wide variety of ways. And we really do celebrate this exhibit as it comes to fruition. I do have to thank, first of all, our librarian for Jewish art and curator, with our guest curator of the exhibit tonight, Sharon, Liberman, Mintz. Sharon, thank you for this wonderful work. We are truly grateful to be able to take advantage of your expertise. And our guest speaker tonight and guest curator for the exhibit, Sam Gruber, the details of whose bio I will add in a moment. But before doing that, I just want to say a word about the JTS Library in this particular time. Many of us are experiencing many difficult emotions over what we are witnessing in the world, and for very good reasons. We are experiencing those things. Those of you who were at the board meeting earlier, I'm sorry for this repetition, but we had a wonderful experience in the library earlier today. We had a class of 9 students doing advanced graduate studies in some field that involves Arabic, medieval world, history of Islam, other varieties of things. So they came from Princeton to the Jewish Theological Seminary Library, and we sat and we looked at manuscripts. And when they saw these Hebrew Jewish manuscripts, before we got to the Arabic, that's where we began, they were so excited and so inspired and so open to what we learned from these materials about the way our cultures came together. The manuscripts we showed were from the Jewish experience in the Muslim Arabic-speaking world. And it was like an oasis of sharing and identification in a world that regrettably is now facing experiences that are very much the opposite of that. So that's what took place in the rare book room of JTS today, and we're happy to be able to celebrate a ray of light like that. Back to the exhibit, you see what is in our exhibition gallery now, and you will hear a lot of details about it. I just want to give a broad introduction to it. Do you have the name up there? Well, no, that's the name of your lecture, right? Right. So the name of the exhibit, as you saw, was A Sacred Space, Synagogue Architecture and Identity. I will just plant a seed for you to bear in mind as we hear Sam's presentation, and that is that these are community creations, these synagogues. It's not the idiosyncrasy of a single individual and their living room, and what paintings do you put up, and what furniture do you put around. The community makes very serious decisions when it creates a communal structure. Who is the architect? How is it designed? What is the ornament? And on and on and on. Synagogues structured Jewish experience, and they brought Jewish communities together in very particular and unique ways. And by examining the choices that a community made in its time and place, we learn an enormous amount about their hopes, their aspirations, their cultural associations, how they either identified or hoped to identify. There's so much to learn here, and you'll see all of that in the exhibit. One thing that's very important about the exhibit, if you read through the exhibits, you will have noticed that many of these synagogues no longer exist. right? Many were destroyed on Kristallnacht, others were destroyed at other times for other reasons, but many were destroyed outright through criminal activities. And this is a past, therefore, that has very little record except in images like this. So as you look at these images and you go back into our gallery, think that what you are doing is stepping back into a history that in its literal reality is no longer, but as portrayed there, we can really feel a lot of what those communities felt. We can identify with their experiences, and what better task to undertake for a library than to help people step back into their important pasts. And so I hope you have that experience in this exhibit as well. Sam Gruber, PhD, is founder and managing director of the Gruber Heritage Global, a cultural resources consulting firm. GHG, I love the combination, includes the Jewish Heritage Research Center, which Gruber has directed since 1995. Sam has taught part-time at Syracuse University since 1994 and is also visiting associate professor of Jewish studies at Cornell. Many other things to add here, but one I thought was particularly important to share in this connection. In 1990, for the World Monuments Fund, Gruber organized and chaired the first international conference on the preservation of Jewish historic sites. He is a true monument man. And he curated the accompanying exhibition, The Future of Jewish Monuments, at the Joseph Gallery of HUCJIR here in New York City, right, downtown. Since then, he has participated and helped organize many related conferences and seminars. Very, very important historic task at places, well, in locations like Paris, Prague, Bratislava, and elsewhere. And you will enjoy both his love for this subject and his great expertise from what you're about to witness.
Thank you, David. And David was modest. He didn't mention that he spoke at that conference in 1990 because he wants you to think he's younger than he is. He was very young. He was a teenager. So was I at that time. I want to thank Sharon for inviting me to work on this exhibition with her. I got a call early in the summer. I was just heading off for Europe, and she said, Sam, I think I'm going to do this show on synagogues. And then I thought, why should I do it? Why don't I have you do it? And I said, okay. And she said, it'll be small. We'll just do like 15 prints, 17 prints. You'll see there are 42 there. We got a little carried away in the research. We found a lot of new things, and we have a lot of questions still unanswered. I think this is an endeavor that will continue into the future, and we've excited some other colleagues in other institutions, so we'll see where it goes. So the reason we'll see where it goes is because it's not a topic that is usually addressed, so we can't say exactly what the trajectory is. Synagogue architecture, yes, everyone talks about synagogue architecture. I've been teaching it for years. I've written a couple books. Many of you have written books, I know, I see you out there. But prints about synagogues, people don't talk about them very much, except to use them as illustrations. And they're usually used as illustrations without much context about what type of print they are, where they were made, why they were made, who used them, what their materiality is. So Sharon and I thought it would be great fun to play with the physical prints rather than looking at online images or illustrations in books, and to begin to address some of these questions. Now, we're also going to use the prints, and I'll try to include that in this presentation this evening, to talk a little bit about the trajectory of architecture, of synagogue architecture. And that means form and siting and decoration, generally the things we call style, but it also deals with the energy, the impetus, the aspirations behind all of those things. What drives the creators, whether they are Christians telling Jews, you must build this way, or Jews saying, we want to build this way, to choose those the particular size or site or decoration. And that's the identity question I think that David talked about, and we'll try to address that a bit tonight too. There is an overlap because the prints are often a way of compressing into a single image what that identity is, or what that identity is hoped to be, if that's the right grammar, I don't know. So let's get started. The first image I'm going to show you, though, is going to be surprising because you came here to hear about prints, and this is not a print. I just want to bring you into how I entered this topic, because a few days after Sharon called me to work on this exhibition, I was in Regensburg, Germany. Regensburg has a terrible history of anti-Jewish violence in its past, in the Middle Ages, and then culminating with a expulsion and killing of Jews in the early 1500s, and the demolition of a beautiful medieval synagogue. Some of you may know that synagogue because even though it's been destroyed for 500 years, it remains today probably one of the three best known, most written about, most illustrated, or at least an illustration that is most reproduced, of any other medieval synagogue, or say four. We have Toledo, we have Worms, we have Prague, and we have Regensburg. We'll see those images in just a minute. But in 1500s, 1529, the synagogue was destroyed, the Jews were expelled, and a church was believed to be built on the site of the former synagogue. In the 1990s, archaeological excavations began, and they revealed foundations of the synagogue, not under the church, not under the adjacent church, but under the square in front. And a result of those excavations was a decision by the city to commemorate that past. This is not Holocaust destruction, this is 16th century destruction. And they commissioned the Israeli sculptor, landscape architect, and monument builder, Danny Caravan, to create a urban environmental landscape sculpture piece. And he created what you see here, which is a piece called Mizrach, and it is evocative of the shape and size of the synagogue, but it's really a public square, it's a place to sit, people come together. In a sense, it could be an urban Beit HaKnesset, a house of gathering. It's not clear that people who gather there in the evenings, which they do, children, people with their dogs, ice cream and books, whether they know they're gathering in a synagogue, but it was meant to evoke that and to offer the potential for that kind of interpretation. Okay, so I was in Regensburg and I was thinking about prints, and so of course I thought immediately of these two prints. See how big they are? They are giant prints. These are two prints by Albrecht Altdorfer. They were made in 1519. I said 29, I meant 1519, when the synagogue was destroyed. And if any of you have read Rachel Vishnitzer's European Synagogue book from the 1950s, you'll see them there, or if you've read Carol Krinsky's book from the 1980s, you'll see them there. They are reproduced in almost every book about synagogue history, and they seem to be such affirmative, such positive documentation of a glorious Jewish past. They're not. These are trophies. These are celebration trophies of the destruction of a Jewish community. And a little more digging allows one to learn that Altdorfer, who's considered one of the pioneers in etching from the Renaissance, the Met has a lot of his work, including these prints. Altdorfer was on the town council that voted to expel the Jews and voted to tear down the synagogue. What he did was to document as a trophy what was being destroyed. And the inscription actually makes it clear. These same town councilors went around and destroyed the Jewish cemetery in Regensburg. The mayor ripped up the gravestone of the daughter of the rabbi who was his contemporary and set it up as a trophy in his courtyard. And other members of the town council took fragments from the cemetery and put them on the walls of their houses. You can still see these on the walls of some buildings as you walk around Regensburg as a triumphant trophy of the destruction and expulsion of the Jews. So we see this print, and for years we've been looking at this print. I saw it as a student of architecture as something affirmative. Look at this great building that the Jews had in the Middle Ages, when in fact the message of this print is entirely anti-Jewish, and it's anti-celebratory, it's defamatory. All right, so this kind of, how am I going to think about synagogue prints after having this revelation. So just to let you know, these are tiny prints. I never knew what the size was until a number of years ago at an exhibition at the Met. I finally saw them in person. And they're about this big. They're tiny. They're tiny. And here you see them on the wall at an exhibition of a number of years ago on the revolution in printing, revolution of printing that was at the Met. So we have these prints and we have to use them very carefully. They can give us very valuable information. This is very detailed information about what a 14th century synagogue or 13th century synagogue looked like. But we also have to remember that every image is a deliberate act of creation and it's made for a purpose. So we have to think about what the purpose is. So the first images that we have of synagogues in the age of printing, printing comes in the late 1400s. By 1508, we're already getting images of synagogues, but they are defamatory synagogues. They are defamatory images. And they are part of preaching against the Jews. This is before the Reformation, which will have its own history of preaching against the Jews, but in the early 1500s, Jewish apostates were recruited, particularly by the Dominicans, to write treatises or tracts against the Jews, both towards Jews to convert them to Christianity, to show them the errors of their ways, but also to Christians to explain the vile behaviors and the deprivations and the eccentricities of Jews too. So in this exhibition, we have two examples of this. They're very famous prints. There's a series of tracts by a guy named Johannes Pfeffenkorn that were published first in 1508. And what we find, though, in the art that's included in these tracts is images of the building which appear to be actually quite accurate, but he fills them with Jews doing behaviors which might seem exotic and odd to a non-Jew, and then all the figures are veiled to show that they don't see they're blind to the new law of Christ. They're not Christian, they're blind to reason. So we're not going to talk about what's going on in these prints, but I just want you to note the images themselves, because what you find are these little hall synagogues, and it's probably the same synagogue that's shown again and again in all of these images. And we have a paved floor, one of them, and we have a checkerboard pattern. We have 3 steps going up to an ark, and the ark is a cabinet in the wall with a wooden door with a lock. And we have windows on the side. We have an arch across the main space, separating it in 2. We have ledges on which candles are placed for illumination. We have some kind of reader's table, a bima, in the center, and on one side we see it's Rosh Hashanah and the shofar is being blown. And then in both we have a partition towards the door where women are. So the women are in the main hall, but they're separate. So this is a lot of information. And since we have so few synagogues of this period, this is very valuable information. And in fact, we can confirm it, sort of, because we have a synagogue like the one in Sopron in Hungary, which does survive in part, and it's almost identical to this in its arrangement. So these are instances like Regensburg, where the intent was defamatory, but still we can derive a lot of information, valuable information from it. The architecture doesn't lie. There was nothing, that they felt that they needed to obscure. And the fact that when Jews were expelled from different places in Europe, particularly in Spain, but in many other places as well, the fact that synagogues were often then transformed into churches shows that for Christians, the buildings were perfectly good. They don't lie. They can have other uses. It's just, let's get rid of the Jews. Let's get rid of the Jews, keep the buildings. Okay, so Jews themselves, though, quickly saw the usefulness of printing. And Jews were very active in printing in many different centers, from the Ottoman Empire and Venice, and Sabionette in Italy, up through to Amsterdam and places in Germany. So by the late 1500s, we're getting printed books in Hebrew, and then soon after in Yiddish, which are serving Jewish purposes, not Christian purposes. These are primarily what we call, the most famous is the Sefer Minchagim, which is a book of customs. And this was a way basically of codifying liturgy, telling people what they were supposed to do at different holidays. And very quickly, by 1593 in Venice, and then in 1662 in Amsterdam, we began getting illustrated versions of this. And clearly, that was useful for sales, and it's more engaging. It probably was engaging for the whole family, just like Passover Haggadahs are illustrated. It doesn't really add anything to the text. It doesn't tell you anything new that you can't find in the text, but it draws you into it. And visual culture is clearly, at this time, this is the Renaissance, or the late Renaissance, clearly appealing to Jews, or it's believed that it's going to appeal to Jews just as it does to Christians. And these are just a few different versions because the book is published more than 50 times, but the illustrations are used again and again, or they're copied and they're adapted a little bit. This one of the man blowing the shofar probably originates in Venice, and the windows here that you're seeing in this version that I have up from this Amsterdam version may reflect a women's gallery actually behind those windows. Those I don't think are window panes. I think that's a screen because we can take it back to an earlier Venetian version. And that's the way, if any of you have been to Venice, the Scola Canton and some of the other synagogues are designed. Okay, so then we begin getting more what I call normalcy. Suddenly, by the early 1700s, in the North, where Protestantism is becoming prevalent in many areas, we begin getting inclusion of Jewish sites in Christian books published, written and published by Christians, but that they don't seem to carry any ideological message. They seem to just report what is there and to include it with a general reportage of the environment, the general environment, which suggests an inclusion, a kind of an acceptance of the Jewish presence, which we haven't found before. And the best examples from this it's really a guidebook to the city of Fürth, which is in Bavaria, very close to Nuremberg. And there's a book done by Johannes Bonner in 1705, published in Nuremberg, with illustrations of all the major buildings in the town. And included in this is this view of the two synagogues, and there's also one of the cemetery as well. And we have a few other things that indicate Jewish presence there. So we see these two synagogues, what's known as the Old Synagogue and the New Synagogue. And the Old Synagogue is kind of a Gothic type building, simple Gothic building that you see on the right. And the New Synagogue is, it's a kind of half timbering that's very common in the vernacular architecture of the time. It's called like Fachwerk. And it seems to be quite accurate. Now, this image is not in the exhibition, but it's from the same book, and it's the interior of the synagogue, of the Old Synagogue. So there it is, the one on the right. Here is the inside. You can see inside it's much more impressive, much more lavish. Keep that in mind because most of the images we have of synagogues, even until today, and even postcard images in the 20th century, and even online images, tend to be the exteriors because that's what it's easiest to photograph. But if you're a non-Jew, you're not likely to know the inside so well. And even if you're a Jew, you're not likely to represent it on Shabbat or on other holidays. So we know a lot about the outside of synagogues. We tend to judge them from their external appearance, but inside is where the action takes place, and that's what we really know. That's where the real synagogue is. That's where the house of prayer, the house of study, the house of gathering is. And you can see what a grand place this is in Fürth. This synagogue becomes the model like a go-to setting for representations of anytime anyone wants to illustrate about Jews. And we find a number of authors who use the Firth Synagogue. So in our exhibition, you'll see this interior view by Johann Bodenschatz. And Bodenschatz in the sorry, I'm just going to get some water. Bodenschatz in the mid-18th century does something like what Pfeffenkorn did in the early 16th century. He's describing Jewish customs, but he's doing it in a much more dispassionate way. He's not trying to convert Jews to Christianity, and he's not trying to disparage Jews to Christians. It's more of an ethnographic approach. And this is what we begin to see from the 18th century on and through the age of the Enlightenment. So here we see a vaulted interior, we see a very ornate arch, and other aspects of the interior. Just a close-up. And if it looks a little church-like, that's not surprising, because in Italy and Germany, a lot of the interior architecture of these synagogues at this time is influenced by Baroque design for churches. So you get a kind of a ciborium over in front of the arch. You have a 4 columns supporting a canopy that might remind you of St. Peter's in Rome, and other aspects. You have a canopy for the pulpit that looks like a preaching church. There's a lot of cross influence from Christian churches into synagogue design. Okay. The other place that change is taking place is in Holland, and this is where there's a radical change in the status of Jews, but also a radical change in the way Jews perceive themselves and present themselves to the public. Because in Firth, all the representations are by Christians, somewhat dispassionately representing Jewish places. But in Holland, the images are created by Jews, increasingly by Jews. They're either commissioned by Jews or purchased by Jews, promoted by Jews, because they're very proud of the contribution they're making to Protestant Amsterdam. And they become part of the community socially and economically. I mean, they're not entirely integrated, but they have a role to play, and they're not hiding, they are promoting. Now, a lot of these are wealthy merchants. They'd come from Portugal and renounced their Catholicism and kind of rediscovered Judaism and were practicing openly, and they allowed the synagogues to be open as well. The first image we have is quite small. It's out there on the wall in the exhibition, very small, and it comes from a guidebook. So there are 2 images in this guidebook that show one of the first synagogues in Amsterdam. It was a merging of 3 small congregations in the mid-17th century, and then they built this one, and it's a pretty grand interior. It's got wooden vaulted roof, it's got 3 aisles, and we begin getting, for the first time ever, galleries, something we take for granted in the 19th century and early 20th century, but this is the first time we see them, and this is where women will be seated, but also visiting non-Jews might be there as guests, and also overflow for men if they have to go up there as well. This gets picked up in the design of the great Portuguese synagogue, which is built in 1675, and is greatly celebrated. So here I want to detour just a bit. One print we don't have in the show, it is in the JTS library. It's not of a synagogue, but it's very important. It's by the 17th century rabbi Judah Leon, known as Il Templo, and it's a print of his reconstruction of what the temple in Jerusalem looked like. And he also had a model which toured and went to England, and sort of kings and princes looked at it. I mean, it was a phenomenon at the time. But this print had a big impact on the design of the Portuguese synagogue and most synagogues going forward. It really shows the temple as this mighty structure. It's really the base of the temple we're looking at, and the temple is up there on the top. But if you see the base of this temple and then you see the exterior of the Portuguese or synagogue in Amsterdam, you can see that there's a immediate correlation the way the buttresses are created. But it's the interior, again, that we want to look at, because the interior is represented in this terrific print that was actually commissioned by the Jewish community. And this was done to celebrate the dedication. They actually had an 8-day dedication. It was a party that went on and on and on with music and poetry and prayers. The names of the donors are listed on the side of this print, and you can see the crowds there celebrating the dedication. What I want to point out, though, is in addition to all of the men praying in the downstairs of the synagogue, as it's known, in the front, on this side of a railing, you see a lot of people who are clearly not dressed for synagogue worship, but they're there as visitors, as tourists, so to speak. This is a device that's very common in Dutch painting of the 17th century, but it's also intentional here because it's showing the openness of the synagogue and the willingness, the eagerness of the Jewish community to show off to a bigger public. They are not hiding in a ghetto. They are not hiding in a courtyard, in a schulhof. They are opening their doors to everyone, and indeed everyone came. The synagogue quickly became the biggest tourist attraction in Amsterdam, and it remained so for decades and decades, and even today it is one of the main attractions in the city. So these are visitors. They could be real, they could be imaginary, but they're representative of an intention. They're also the visitors to the synagogue, but they are surrogates for all. They're meant to be all of the Dutch people who are welcome to come and look in. Look at that great arc. We'll look at it again in just a minute. The Portuguese synagogue, the Synagogue synagogue, was built almost simultaneously with the Ashkenazi synagogue, the great Ashkenazi synagogue in Amsterdam, which you see here on your right. And the two looked across a canal at each other. So there was a dialogue between the Ashkenazi and the Sephardi, and there was competition between the two groups. The same architect worked on both buildings, so there's a certain similarity. They both do have galleries. They both have columns on the inside. But I think it's the Portuguese synagogue that's going to have more influence. They're made of brick. They have big windows, which is necessary in the northern clime of Holland because we need light in the synagogue. But the most important thing is they are extraordinarily public. They are public buildings and part of a public landscape. Inside, we get a whole range of views because there's a bigger ethnographic project published by a guy, Bernard, J.F. Bernard, beginning in the 1720s. It's then published in 5 languages. It goes through many printings throughout the 1700s, but it includes descriptions not just of Jews, but of many other ethnic and religious minorities or new peoples discovered around the world. But the Jewish section is one of the fullest and clearest, and it's illustrated with views done by another Bernard Picart, who clearly is doing scenes from life in the Dutch Sephardi community. And the community seems to open itself up to these views and happily allowing its internal workings, its ceremonies, to be seen by a much larger Jewish and non-Jewish public. Here's that great ark, and you can read about it in the label. There were, I forget how many, 30 Torah scrolls, and it's made of very valuable wood that comes from South America. It's been written about a lot. It's classical in design with columns, kind of Renaissance articulation. And I want you to note especially all the windows that are seen in this print. There are 72 huge windows in this synagogue. It's just a temple of light, if you will, and no electricity even to this day, so thousands of candles when the community was wealthy enough to afford that. So the influence is very strong. We see it in other Dutch synagogues. These are 2 more in in the exhibition from The Hague and from Rotterdam. And you can see there's a certain similarity in style. They're also fairly prominent in their community. By law, they tend to be set back from the street, but they're big enough still to be seen. They're not hiding. And then, of course, that enclosed courtyard allows greater security, something we all appreciate now, but it also allows a place for a sukkah, it allows a place for other outdoor gatherings. It's very functional, but it's an intermediary space between, you might say, the profane and the sacred, where people can enter the enclosure of the community, but not fully engage yet in worship. So it's a liminal space, but useful. This is a print that's a big puzzle to us. It's a well-known print. Actually, there are many versions of it because several were used in a sort of encyclopedic book by by a Catholic cleric, Calmet, in the 18th century. He also wrote a history of Jews and customs, mostly Old Testament, mostly for him drawing from what the Christians call the Old Testament descriptions of the temple and the like. But he does talk about the synagogue, and this illustration is used to show that. We have not figured out what synagogue this is. It looks like it ought to be a real synagogue, a real place, and it's the 18th century, so we ought to be able to figure it out, but it's not clear. Calmet was French Catholic. The artist, Matthias Poel, though, was Dutch and I think Protestant. So it's an interesting, so whether this is something in Holland or in France or maybe even in Italy or England, we just don't know yet. But you'll see this print, different versions of it, circulating because it was in this book that was very popular. You'll see black and white versions. And then what we see with the Calmet print is it has a life of its own as a separate image. And beginning in the 18th century, then really picking up in the 19th century, that's what happens. Images from the books migrate out, and we find that they are objects of their own that are being printed, hand-colored, sold as sheets to individuals. We don't know who are buying these sheets. I suspect a lot of Jews are buying them because Jews are entering the middle class and are decorating their businesses and their homes with art. In the 19th century, most of you know about Moritz Daniel Oppenheim's serving this public in Germany, and there were other painters in England doing the same. One of these artists in England was a man named Isaac Mendes Belisario. He came from Jamaica, and this is one of the first images of a synagogue interior in modern times that we can definitely say that a Jewish artist created, and it's dedicated, there's a dedication on it to the congregation. This is made 100 years after Bevis Marks in London opens, but it probably looked much the same. It's a smaller version of the Portuguese synagogue in Amsterdam, but Belisario does a painting, and then it's turned into a print, and we have a beautiful, there are not many copies of this surviving, and there's a beautiful version here at JTS that's in the exhibition. So after Bevis Marks, there's a real avalanche, of synagogue building in England, and it's paralleled in Germany and France, because we're in the age of the Enlightenment and emancipation, and very quickly laws and restrictions about where Jews can live, what they can build, how they can present themselves in public are falling away. So between 1791 in France and 1870 in Italy and in Germany, 1871 in Germany, the whole world of Western European or Central European Jewry is changed. And this is the area, the period of the Haskalah, the rise of Reform Judaism, which is different from what we know as Reform Judaism today, but a kind of modernization of Judaism and a acculturation of communities so that they can work and interact and socialize in a larger majority milieu. And what we see are a very rapid development of different architectural styles, usually in keeping with the tastes of the time. So Jews are not calling the shots, they're looking around and they're saying, you know, the court is building in this style, we should build in that style too. Or sometimes they'll just hire the architect who's building for the court and say, hey, could you design a building for us? This was frequently the case in Austria and Germany, and to a lesser extent in England. But in this case, James Spiller was a very popular architect, and he designs this very classical Georgian building in 1809. It's the third synagogue on that site. He designs it for the Ashkenazi community in London. It's the Duke's Place Synagogue, which is the Ashkenazi rival to that Sephardic Bevis Marx. And I'm not going to go through all of these synagogues in detail, but I just will indicate, you can see the prints, how lavish some of them are. Most of them are lavish, much more lavish on the inside, though, than the outside. It's only in sort of the mid-century that that changes. And in mid-century, there's also growing public interest in Jews and the way Jews present themselves and in synagogues per se, and we begin getting a lot of illustrations of synagogues in popular non-Jewish media. These are two prints of the same building. The one on the left comes from Harper's Weekly in New York. The one on the right is from the London Illustrated News. These are the same event, the same day, and they're published simultaneously, but on two different continents. So it shows how widespread and international interest was the interest in new synagogue buildings. This is the consecration of the great Portland Street Synagogue in London. The one on the left is especially interesting to me because of the decorum and the elegance of the men shown there, but also see the prominence of the women in the gallery above. This is a new aspect of 19th century synagogue design, particularly in the synagogues built by the wealthy, by the elite of different communities. This synagogue in Liverpool, very little hardly known. You won't find it in many books. I find it fascinating because it was described as Byzantine, and this was in the mid-19th century when the term wasn't being used too much. They have this great big dome, so it's very prominent. Unfortunately, the dome was structurally unstable, so it was torn down soon afterward, but it was a good try. It was a good try. And then the building, is very prominent on the street. It's set back a little bit with an elegant fence, but we see here this conventional motif of people promenading, which shows the linkage of the privacy of the synagogue with the public realm. This interests me especially because the person who drew it and published it and sold it was a Jewish artist. And as someone I know nothing about or didn't know about until I started looking at this print, his name is John Raphael Isaac, and he was a draftsman, printer, engraver, lithographer, and print seller in Liverpool. And I suspect that Jews were much more involved in this trade than we know, and that's something to be researched going forward. The architect was not Jewish, Thomas Wiley, who was hired by the community. I should also say that building is interesting because it's split off from another synagogue, and this will interest David Kaufman. This is the time when communities are splintering, congregations are splintering, which of course means an acceleration of building new buildings. And each congregation that builds a new building wants to promote it because they are no longer guaranteed members, they have to recruit members, and therefore public image and public presence is very important. You can't be hidden away behind walls, you have to be seen in order to attract a congregation. This is a synagogue that was created by wealthy Sephardi and wealthy Ashkenazi Jews who didn't want to be associated with either group. They wanted to pray together in an English way. They wanted to be British Jews, not Sephardi Jews or Ashkenazi Jews, and they came up with their own minhag, their own rite, which essentially is the beginnings of British Reform Judaism. And here's a big building in Manchester. This was a building that was still being discussed at that conference in 1990 because it had just been torn down. It was built in 1858, a magnificent building, but the community moved out. It wasn't destroyed by events like Kristallnacht. It was destroyed by the success of the Jewish community that moved to better neighborhoods. They moved to the suburbs. This is the same story as in America. The old synagogue was sold, it was reused, and eventually it was dilapidated and was a safety hazard, and nobody had a use or inclination to invest money in it, and so it was demolished. All right, David, you haven't cut me short yet, but I saw you look at your watch once, so we'll try to wrap things up. I want to rush through. I'm going to just give you a lot of views of some things in France. This one I want to show you especially because it too is the work of a Jewish artist. It's not a great drawing. It's a lithograph from a drawing by a man who we know only by his signature on the drawing, which is S. Steinberger, but he identifies himself with the signature, as, this is the one on the left, as a student of the Jewish Technical School in Strasbourg. So again, 1860, we have a Jewish artist making this print, probably for a Jewish audience. I just compare it with one other. We have one other image of the synagogue, which I show you here, from a program or something. I'm not sure where the source is, which is more of a detail of the ark. And it's this weird Egyptian motif. But when you think that the building was built in the 1830s in France, it becomes immediately clear, because after Napoleon's conquest of Egypt and the great success of this encyclopedia, Egyptian encyclopedia that was being published at the time, Egyptomania, that was the rage, and it affected Jews too. So these prints show us a lot about Jewish life in France. We have the foundation stone laying in Wissembourg. This was a state occasion because the state financed the building of synagogues. We have a big view. This one is not in the exhibition, but it is typical of prints of the time. This is the great synagogue on the Rue de Notre-Dame de Nazareth in Paris in 1852, and this became the home synagogue for the Grand Rabbi of Paris and for the Rabbi of France. These are two prints that are in the exhibition, and they show the installation of rabbis. In one case, the Grand Chief Rabbi of Bordeaux, and the other, the Chief Rabbi of Paris. And you can see how ornate these are, but very formal and hierarchical. One aspect that is really remarkable are these giant menorahs that seem to have been the norm in French synagogues at that time, placed right at the end of the bima. Here's another one, the same view. This is a different installation, but in that same synagogue. Now I want to contrast that with a print from France from the 1870s, from the Monde Illustré. This is an image very different. The decorum, the formality of prayer that you saw in those other scenes is gone, and we kind of have a helter-skelter type of praying. It's a little synagogue. See how low the roof is? There's just this one column supporting it. It says that it's on the Saint-Louis-en-l'Île, which is the big street on the island, you know, very close to Notre Dame in Paris. Couldn't find any. We found no record of a synagogue there. This was probably just a synagogue in a room in a building, and this is a more orthodox or traditional congregation than the formal reform of the emancipated Jews. And the artist, while it's a very lively rendering, it's not clear whether he's excited by the scene or he's actually saying, look how crazy these Jews are. This is really cacophony. This is chaos. This is what happens when you let these Eastern Jews come into France. That certainly would have been the case in the 1930s, but this is from the 1870s, so hard to say. You know, we can't read his mind, but we can only look at the image and imagine. And a similar image from Rome in the 1820s by the artist Hieronymus Hess also shows a rare image of the interior of an Italian synagogue, which were not generally represented in prints. And this is one of the so-called Cinque Scuole in Rome, where 5 synagogues were put in one building because of the restrictions of the ghetto. It seemed to be a fairly accurate depiction of the interior, so like those ones from Pfefferkorn in 1508. But again, the behavior of the crowd is very raucous. It looks like they're at a betting parlor or a tavern, and it's definitely derogatory. And he was a caricaturist, but in this case, he certainly seems to be caricaturing the Jews. Not clear exactly to what purpose. A different type of caricature or stereotyping is found in this evocative scene of the medieval synagogue, the Great Synagogue of Toledo. This is also French, though, and this is sort of fits into the French views of colonialism and of the Orient, and the Jews are cast in this light, but it's shown as a broken, ruined place, and that's kind of the depiction of what Jewry was in the Sephardi world in Spain and North Africa. That's what the French saw. So it's a very beautiful print. It's in the exhibition, you'll see it, but think about what the message might be. It's not just showing a ruin, it's probably saying something a little bit more. On the contrary, we have an almost contemporary view of the Altneuschel in Prague. This is published by a Jewish publisher, W. Pascalis, in Vienna, and his goal was to promote Jewish history and culture. And this is more of a celebratory print of the antiquity of the Jews, and it's part of a series in a magazine that he published about Jewish history, and he wanted to instill Jewish pride. And those two buildings became kind of the touchstones for Jewish history in Europe, and they still are today. Okay, this you can still see, this is from a recent book about Prague. The image, a photographic image, it's almost the same. All right, let me wrap up here. I'm going to go through a few more images from Austria and Germany. I think the idea is the same. I don't have to repeat what it means, but some of these buildings are very important because of their architects. This is by Gottfried Semper in Dresden, and this is the great Oranienburger Strasse Synagogue, or the Neue Synagogue in Berlin, destroyed in the war and then partially rebuilt in the 1990s. You can visit it today. This was a landmark in Berlin, and once again is a landmark in Berlin. But this was built in the 1850s and introduced all sorts of new technologies and new styles, and this was very influential more in America than anywhere else. This is a building I knew nothing about before I looked at this print, a little synagogue in Frankfurt, and it's a mix of kind of Gothic and Moorish, again from the mid 19th century. And it's interesting because it's part of a series of views of Frankfurt, and it's framed with figures, kind of German mythological figures. So it is putting the German Jewish building directly in the German cultural orbit. It's not separating Jews, it's embracing them as part of the culture. This building on the left was in Germany. It's now part of Poland, but it's destroyed. And it's an interesting print, but it clearly shows that it derives from the also destroyed Vienna synagogue on Leopoldstatter. This synagogue from Königsberg, which previously, as I think might have been mentioned earlier, was identified as from Vienna in the collection, but we corrected that. This is by an otherwise unknown Jewish artist named Krakauer. Not sure his first name is really Walter, from 1917. He has an interesting artist mark of a menorah down on the lower left, but his work still has to be researched. Kaliningrad is now Königsberg is now Kaliningrad, which is part of Russia, but it was East Prussia at the time. This is a great synagogue in Hanover, which was designed by the Jewish architect Edwin Oppler. And this is as close as you get to what we might want to call a cathedral synagogue. Oppler was definitely looking at the great German churches of the Renaissance for inspiration. There's a detail. And then we come to the end. We have 4 images in the show from New York, and New York architects and New York patrons, Jewish patrons, are looking to Europe, but they're looking to Europe with pride. They can do anything in America, nothing's stopping them. In Europe, despite emancipation in the 19th century, there were still social and economic pressures on Jews to behave in certain ways. And the creation of the Moorish style, horseshoe arches, sort of a Spanish look, probably comes as much from authorities and Christian architects saying we have to do something ornate and historic, but it shouldn't look European. We don't want anyone to think a synagogue is a church. Or as Jews, you're really not part of European culture. You're not a European nation. You're something Eastern or Oriental. But when Americans see these Moorish synagogues built, like Oranienburger Straße in Berlin or the Tempelgasse in Vienna, they look at them, and they don't look at them in person. They're looking at prints, actually. They're not seeing something exotic. They're seeing something with a wow factor. They're saying, man, Jews are building like crazy. Look at these wonderful things. We can do that here. And after the Civil War, American Jews begin to do that. Isaac Mayer Wise in Cincinnati builds Plum Street Synagogue, and then Temple Emmanuel, right here in New York on Fifth Avenue at 43rd Street, builds their first super synagogue, technologically advanced with cast iron, with glass, with gas lighting, and designed by two Jewish architects, Leopold Eidlitz and Henry Fernbach, both of whom come from Europe fully trained and bringing the latest news, so to speak. Temple Emmanuel is widely illustrated and continually. You can go through issues of Harper's Weekly and you'll find lots of illustrations. It's very also inviting to, obviously, the non-Jewish public, so it becomes the face of New York uptown Judaism. And then, of course, after 1880, when East European Jews emigrate en masse to New York, or from York to New York, there becomes that tension. But even when Eldridge Street Synagogue is built on the Lower East Side in the 1880s, to some extent, it's emulating the style and the presence of buildings like Temple Emmanuel. And Central Synagogue, which we see here, designed by Henry Fernbach in 1872, but we see it in a 1930s art print by a man named Warner Byrne, but despite that name, he's Jewish. I don't know what it was originally, but on Find a Grave, you know, he's buried in a Jewish cemetery, so I assume he is. And then one of my favorite prints in the entire show, this beautiful print by Ernest David Roth from 1924 of the old Temple Beth El by Arnold Brunner. But you can see by the 20s, even by the 1890s, 1900s, postcards and other photographs are becoming more popular, and the need for having prints to document things and to present images has gone. It's evaporated. It's no longer relevant. So we begin getting artists doing art prints rather than promotion prints, so to speak. And this is just a beautiful, beautiful etching by Roth. Roth is mostly known for he's sort of a disciple of Whistler, and he's mostly known for his views of Venice and other places like that. And then we'll end with this last one of Temple Emmanuel. Temple Emmanuel in the 1920s, and this was dedicated in January 1930. This is when those two other buildings were torn down, essentially, they closed. Beth El and Temple Emmanuel merged, and this was built. Totally different in style. It looks more church-like than those others. It looks less unusual. It's design based sort of on Norman churches from Sicily, where there was a big Jewish presence. They're Jewish architects. They're trying to make a Jewish statement, but they are using a historicist language of the Romanesque. But if you look at it, it's really a New York building, a New York Jewish building with the 12 tribes around the doorway. It commands its position, and it's meant to be in, if not opposition, at least in association with St. Patrick's Cathedral, which is just down the street, about 15 blocks away. It has a campanile. Oh, no, that's not a campanile. That's just hiding the water tower on the top of the building, but it's an architectural embellishment that is appreciated by the congregation. I think there's an elevator there as well. Okay, that kind of wraps it up. There's a lot more in this show. I hope that gave you a taste and something to think about when you look at all the different prints. It just scratches the surface. You can think this way when you look at all images of buildings, not just Jewish buildings. What does the image mean? And you can then look at the actual buildings, because we still have plenty of synagogues in New York, and you can say, what were the architects thinking? What was the congregation thinking? What message were they sending? Did they succeed, and is it relevant today? Okay, thanks a lot, and enjoy.
Thank you, Sam, and thank you all for coming. I'm quite sure that you, like I, feel very enriched. We've learned a lot. You can go see the prints which are available. The library is still open, and so please spend some time now that you have more to help you interpret what you see. Thank you for coming.